Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders, 2025 Regional Edward R. Murrow Award winner for Best Podcast. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
So Gabby, our discussion today, I think it trends along the lines of something we took up earlier this year. Remember when we talked about microplastics, right? Fascinating episode about UNM research into the topic. So in that discussion, we got to understand a little bit more about the nearly invisible man-made substances that are finding their way into our bodies and a lot of our environment as well.
Yeah, I remember that episode very clearly.
Yeah.
Today's discussion is kind of similar. You might have heard of PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's different from microplastics, but similarly, they are man-made synthetic chemicals found in a lot of products that we use regularly, and they don't break down in the environment. PFAS have been increasingly linked to negative health impacts.
Yeah, and apparently New Mexico as well is a hotspot for PFAS contamination, particularly near some of our military bases. It's something the state's Environment Department has sounded the alarm on in recent years, and we're talking about it today with one of the people who is at the center of that alarm. That is Secretary James Kenney of the New Mexico Environment Department joining us here. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. An important topic.
Yeah, so PFAS is found in products like nonstick cookware, firefighting foam, food packaging, stain-resistant fabrics, but you are more of an expert than we are on this topic. Can you explain what are PFAS and why are these chemicals in so many products?
Yeah, and thank you for having me. Thank you for the conversation. This is an area that I never wanted to be an expert in. Let me say that up front, but as you point out, New Mexico is ground zero for a lot of PFAS activity nationally. So we became experts. And to your question, what are PFAS? These are chemicals that actually have a history in New Mexico all the way dating back to the Manhattan Project. So New Mexico has a background with PFAS for that purpose. And then the chemical companies started using them in everything to make our lives easier. So carpet tiles, right, to make sure that they don't, or carpets just in general, to make sure that they are stain resistant. Clothing, to make sure that when we're out doing our outdoor rec and enjoying hiking, that rain and snow doesn't penetrate our clothes. Ski wax, another big outdoor rec area in New Mexico. So we started seeing PFAS being introduced for its function. It keeps water from penetrating whatever it's put on, and it keeps grease and things like that from staining our apparel, our home goods, etc. So it's everywhere in our society. But what recently started to happen is that people started seeing really adverse health effects, and it's a full range of health effects, and we'll probably get into those in just a moment. But adverse health effects for sure.
Yeah. And so these are still found in a lot of products here today. I think there's some cognizance that potentially, and we can talk a little bit more about these health effects in just a moment, but they're still being used very much today, right?
Yeah, and in New Mexico, where we're seeing them used the most is in firefighting foam. So PFAS have the ability, when mixed with water and then aerated, to form a foam. I mean, there's no other way to say it. It looks like soap foam. And it's used to put out like jet fuel fires or hydrocarbon-based fires. So you won't see it used in putting out forest fires, which is great, but you will see it used in more of those hydrocarbon type, hot accelerant type fires. It's used for that.
Yeah. So the EPA website says there are links associated for links to risks associated with pregnant women, developmental delays in kids, increased risk of some cancers, risks to the immune system, the body's hormones, cholesterol levels, and I think there's probably more to go on off of that. But when did we start discovering that these chemicals are problematic? And do you recall a time? Has it just been most recently that we've discovered this?
So I think, as New Mexicans and as Americans, we started hearing about this in what I'll call recent years, but the chemical companies, including the military, knew of their adverse health effects dating all the way back to the 1960s. So while it's not in our collective psyche and it's not a household name back then like it is now, the health effects are documented all the way back to the 1960s. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's
I
really
had no
interesting.
idea that people knew about like health risks that long ago.
One quick question. I mean, do you put this on par, the risks with PFAS, to something like, smoke from cigarettes or the effect that alcohol we know can have on a body? Is it kind of like at that same type of level?
I think it is. One of the things that is a newer risk of understanding what PFAS does in your body is it suppresses the efficiency of vaccines. So when you think about, a parent getting their child vaccinated for things like measles, another topical conversation happening in New Mexico, if you think you're immune to that, but it suppresses the efficiency of that vaccine, then you're not as protected as you thought you were. So the science around the adverse impacts of PFAS exposure in your body seems to keep growing since the 1960s. And more recently, I think to your point, we're realizing that it is as bad as alcohol abuse or tobacco use and things like that.
I'll note on your bio on the environmental department's website, it says you have, quote, championed grassroots activism from within state government to support communities afflicted with toxic PFAS contamination. And I understand you previously worked for the EPA. What's your own background, though? Why has this become such a major topic for you?
Yeah, and I'm proud of saying that government can be grassroots activists. I think we sometimes find government unattainable, unreachable. It's more of a noun than a verb. And I think government should be fully a verb. And what I mean by that is we should be in communities. We should be sitting around kitchen tables. We should be talking to residents about what their exposure has been and what harms they've seen in their family. And while it's not conclusive when we do sit around kitchen tables and hear people's stories about family members having everything from undiagnosed conditions to things like cancer, it's not conclusive that it's from PFAS. You have to. That's where you begin the journey of discovery, and start to put the pieces together. And that's why I think a little bit of grassroots activism there is important. I think going back in my own experience as an engineer and working with communities at EPA, I found that, having government be an arm's length away from the community disconnects you from the realities people are facing. Like, it's not an academic issue that's happening in Clovis right now, Clovis, New Mexico. It's a real issue that people are waking up every day asking, should I mix my infant's formula? Can I bathe my children? Can I make my coffee? Can I water my garden? These are real questions, and so I'm proud that I'm leading a department, and we have a group of people who are also of the mindset that government should be out doing something. It's often frustrating sitting in an office and knowing people are unsure of how to live their life in their community, and working really hard to help them is our goal.
Follow-up question to what you just said, though. Was there a specific thing or a catalyst that you had that was like, I need to pay more attention to this?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I started my career at EPA in 1996, and I remember as a young engineer sitting in an office building in downtown Philly where a coworker said to me, hey, I'm going out to West Virginia to look at these cows that are dying from something. And we didn't know what it was in 1996. Turns out it was PFAS, actually. And here I am now, 2025, as, leading the environment department, dealing with cows that are dying of PFAS. So I think my focus on PFAS stems to the early part of my career, but as a policymaker working for the governor, I think what is, and having the knowledge that I do about what's happening in New Mexico, I think we should be running around like our hair's on fire, honestly. because it is one of the most egregious and significant pollution events that's happening not only in New Mexico, but of our generation. I mean, this is going to go down in history as the poisoning of the United States and the poisoning of a New Mexico community. And I think I don't want to look back on this in 5 years or 10 years and say I could have done more. I want to do everything and more today.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of what we're seeing here in terms of PFAS contamination at home here in New Mexico. We know that some of the biggest cases of PFAS have been found in the environment are near a few of our state's military bases. You mentioned one of the first ones, the big areas of detection near Clovis on the eastern edge of the state.
Yeah, and in 2022, Highland Dairy in Clovis found out that several of the wells on their property were contaminated with PFAS from the nearby Kenney Air Force Base. It eventually led to the euthanizing of the entire herd of dairy cows. It's around 3,600 animals. And from what I read, an industry publication called Dairy Herd Management, they put this article online saying, quote, the removal plan is the first of its kind nationally for addressing PFAS contaminated cows as a hazardous waste. So from your perspective, just how unique, how harmful was the situation, or is the continued really situation for Highland Dairy, which essentially had to get rid of its entire herd?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's crazy because none of us, I mean, maybe paint the picture for a second. And for those of us who are unfamiliar with Clovis, it's a fantastic rural America kind of town where people are going into the cafes and they know each other. You know, you go into Chipotle there and you're going to see military members, you're going to see community members. You go to local diners and you know, people know what you're going to order. They know you're from out of town as well because they all know each other. It's a great community in New Mexico. It really is. And it's just a slower way of life. And you know why people choose it once you're there for a few days, because it just doesn't have any of the issues that the rest of New Mexico has, good or bad. It is its own little community, and it's a great part of New Mexico. So when you think about now how a cow in my world, in my life, in my career, I've seen ground, like soil, contaminated with hazardous waste. I've seen water contaminated with hazardous waste. I've never seen a living animal considered to be a regulated amount of hazardous waste. And I mean, like, that's mind-boggling to me, right? And I think to your point, it's like, wow, that's crazy. It is crazy. We shouldn't accept that. But it happened. And those cows had to be euthanized and then buried on site to decompose so that we could eventually dig up what remains, which is just the PFAS. So I've never, in my entirety of my environmental career, have seen something like this or thought I'd be dealing with something like this. And I think it's really brought a new lens, kind of when Dairy Herd Magazine is covering hazardous waste in New Mexico as a dairy cow. You've hit a new low, and again, one that I would have never guessed that I would have seen.
Yeah. How is that from the water that they were drinking? And it reminds me of the microplastics conversation, because that was another point the UNM researcher was making, was like, it's getting into the meat from just groundwater.
So our Department of Ag and the Environment Department came together and said, what can we do? And what we wound up doing is working with the farmer to keep the cows alive for as long as possible, to see if they would pass the PFAS, or it would break down. If they drank cleaner, better water, would it eventually leave their body? And the point was it wasn't. It was in the milk, and therefore there was really no option at that point other than to euthanize the entire herd. So you're right. It's like those microplastics. They don't leave your body. The PFAS doesn't leave your body in a similar way.
I think that's one of the really interesting points here, is that, I think we have this sort of idea that When we look at the way that, like, say, viruses affect humans, right? Once, like, let's say cancer, for example, once that person eventually passes, right? That's sort of where the virus ends, right? This is a different situation, different scenario. What you're saying is that eventually these animals decompose. Their remains will be, gone, but what is left essentially is those PFAS chemicals will still be there, right? And that is still a continued, once it's there, it will always be there, no matter in what sort of shape or form, is really what it sounds like.
Yeah, and while we're talking about Clovis and Cannon Air Force Base in that area, what we saw at Holloman, to your point about it will always be there even when they decompose, even if one of these little kangaroo rats that we detected high levels of PFAS in were to decompose in a pristine area, no PFAS in the soil, but let's assume that it died and decomposed, it would be 700 times the action level for cleanup. In other words, the remains, or all that remains, I should say, is the PFAS, and it would be significantly higher than what would be allowable under cleanup standards.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Well, it sounds like the state right now is still trying to mitigate what happened to that dairy and the continued risks surrounding the community there in Clovis. What have you learned from the Highland Dairy situation, and is it over with?
Yeah, I think the Highland Dairy situation was somewhat like our silent spring. We were awakened to this contamination was worse than we thought. The plume continues to migrate under these farms towards the southeast corner of of off base, southeast off base. About 8 to 12 miles away is Southwest Cheese, where that's North America's largest cheese plant. And between the base and Southwest Cheese is really all dairy farms. So why I'm so concerned about this is because their groundwater is affected. That's what they use to feed their cows. So could Highland Dairy repeat? Sure, it could with other dairies. Also, an economic collapse if the dairy industry goes under and Southwest Cheese would then, not have all that dairy, all that milk to make their product. So I think what we learned is that you can't wait on things like this, right? You have to take action, and you can't second guess yourself. So the Environment Department said to Art Scott at Highland Dairy, he said, I don't know what to do with these cows, and I'm going to euthanize them. And we said, we're going to pay you, give you money in order to manage these in the best way possible so you don't continue to contaminate the soil or the groundwater with the decomposition of those cows.
Yeah.
Lots of learning going on in that matter.
I want to talk a little bit about the attempts here at cleanup. We should add that part of the narrative here is a lawsuit the state has filed against the U.S. Department of the Air Force for PFAS contamination cleanup at Cannon Air Force Base. I know Cannon, if you go to their Air Force bases, they have an environment page, and one of the splash sort of photos at the top is about when they broke ground on a pilot study to assess PFAS contamination at the base. I believe that was at least around 3 years ago when they broke ground on that project. But I'm not entirely sure of the status of that. Perhaps you can illuminate us on that. But also, it sounds like whatever is happening, the state feels like is not enough, fast enough.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that my first week in office, January 2019, getting my sea legs, so to speak, here in New Mexico as the Environment Secretary, we had issued a permit to clean up PFAS to Cannon Air Force Base. And rather than appeal the permit, which people do every day, they disagree with us, we work it out, and we figure things out that way. But rather than do that, they sued us in federal court saying, you can't tell us to clean up PFAS. So my first week was met with a federal lawsuit by the Department of Justice on behalf of their client saying, we're not going to do this, and you don't have the right to make us. So then, to pick up the narrative where you left off, that's where New Mexico came back and sued the Department of Defense and said, we actually do have the right to have you clean this up. And you can have all these legal conversations. I think it's morally reprehensible that the federal government, a public entity, would do this to the people of Clovis. But that's maybe an aside for the moment. And what you're pointing out is that, yes, they did begin cleaning up the PFAS contamination that was on base. Again, they draw that water up for the servicemen and women to drink. So they started cleaning the PFAS up on base. They continue to do that. But what they didn't address and haven't addressed is the 4-mile plume that goes under all the dairy farms. And there's no plan to clean that up. They're not budgeted to clean that up. They'll tell you they're going to clean it up, but, show me the money, show me the plan. And for 6 years, we haven't seen it.
What's the status of that? Is it still tied up in a legal battle?
It's still tied up in a legal battle. And I'm an engineer by education, so some of the law does, the back and forth gets a little exhausting. But the point being is that our lawsuit got collapsed into a bunch of lawsuits around the country. And just recently, the judge over all those lawsuits said, I want to see New Mexico's lawsuit go first. So even though we're in a sort of grouping of lawsuits, New Mexico's lawsuit is moving in federal court, which we're really happy about that.
Yeah,
okay.
I believe that's sort of a bellwether status, right?
Exactly,
case, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And what happens here will be indicative of what happens around the country as well.
Another one of the big contamination concerns is obviously our second military installation in New Mexico, Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo. The situation there is a little different. While Cannon's PFAS contamination seems to be mostly underground and dealing with the aquifer, Holloman AFB's contamination involves a surface lake called Lake Holloman. Researchers at UNM have been studying this area and recently found PFAS levels there at the, quote, highest concentrations recorded anywhere. How is Holloman's issue different, and what risks are you seeing there?
Yeah, I don't want to miss that opportunity to say, to reiterate what you said. The highest documented quantity of PFAS in the environment between animals and plant life in the world is in New Mexico, is at Lake Holloman. So I think that, again, why are we taking PFAS on like a grassroots activist? I mean, that should tell you, right? That's significant. The PFAS issues at Lake Holloman, and again, to maybe paint the picture, you're sort of nestled between White Sands. So if you've been to White Sands before and took the family there and really understand how majestic that part of our state is, right next door is Lake Holloman. I mean, and I don't mean next door as in a farm kind of way. I mean right next door. That Lake Holloman, you can drive right up to. You can go to trails.com. You can see that there's hiking around there. You can see that people would recreate all around Lake Holloman. And then what we found is that literally, and we can provide some photos, that there is PFAS foam, kind of what you would see sprayed on a jet fuel fire. It is blowing right out of the lake and landing on the shore. So if you have a child who's like, what's this foam? It's PFAS. And so that gives us significant concern about what's happening there, both from the environment, but then potentially people coming into contact with something they don't know is toxic.
Do they get in that lake? Are people allowed inside that water?
No, I have never seen anyone get in that water. I don't think most people would choose to do it. It's a rocky kind of area. It's not conducive to getting in there. Could someone throw a canoe in or a paddleboard? Yeah, absolutely, they could. But there are signs posted that this is a wastewater area for Holloman Air Force Base. But I don't think it's sufficient in terms of keeping people from, we're in a desert.
Yeah.
Large body of water looks appealing some days.
Yeah. Well, and I should note that one of the other things, you mentioned the foam blowing out there. I think one of the other things, too, is that, the wildlife that see that body of water do not know any different that it's a wastewater lake, right? And so what we've seen in some of UNM's research is that, you're seeing plenty of migratory birds landing in that water, drinking it up. I think the UNM research pointed to a herd of, I'm not sure if I'm going to say it right, orcs or oryx.
Yeah.
I always get it confused right before I say it. So, but anyway, a herd of those animals are as well using that lake and ingesting the water from that. And what they have found from animal carcasses is, again, high levels of PFAS. But the migratory faction too, I think, points to another thing. You mentioned foam blowing out of the lake, but these are birds that are able to travel miles away and carry that contamination out as well, it sounds like, to other places, right, where they become part of the food chain as well.
Exactly. And what we've seen is hunters actually calling the environment department in our game and fish department saying, I've hunted ducks, I've hunted other game there. Can I eat the meat? I think that UNM study that you're referencing says that if you were to eat a gram, which, think about maybe a dime size amount of duck meat, you would exceed the lifetime exposure of PFAS with that one bite.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So
you're saying no to these hunters. Do
not eat it. Yeah, throw it away. I mean, it's a horrible situation where we're having to advise a hunter. He may be out there taking their son out, learning how to sort of, forage and get a sense of what it's like to be in the wilderness, that you can't eat wild game. I mean, I've always been more suspicious of like the factory farm kind of products, right? I think that just is sort of how we're taught, and you should go grass-fed, natural, all of those things. And here it's just the opposite with that wild game. Don't eat it. I think the UNM researchers have also seen, which concerns me from an ecological standpoint, ulcers and hatchlings that are deformed or otherwise unable to survive. And when you think about that, we're not really quantifying the loss of our natural environment, of those species. We're really just talking about those that are polluted with PFAS. So we're not clear how it's interrupting their life cycle.
Just to clarify, because obviously we're a huge big game hunting state, are you all advising people statewide to not eat the game that they hunt in New Mexico, or just reserved to these specific areas near the military bases?
Yeah, just reserved to those areas near the military bases. And Lake Holloman in particular at this point. And it's not because we have the data to confirm statewide it's safe or not safe. We just don't have the data yet. We're still focused around the bases.
Yeah. So obviously, when we talk about Lake Holloman, it's federal property, federal jurisdiction. But what has the state done to try to address contamination concerns at Lake Holloman? And what in your eyes needs to happen there?
Yeah, so again, we address it through lawsuits, which, feels frustrating to me even, and I'm sure many of us. But we sought an injunction to prohibit public access to Lake Holloman. That's not been recognized by the Department of Defense, which, again, you can go and drive right up there, camp there, etc. We're seeking that they clean it up. So the Environment Department cleans up to safe standards, but that could still mean there's some degree of PFAS in the lake. And then another agency in the state, the Office of the Natural Resources Trustee, they clean up to background levels, or they make sure that it's cleaned up to pre-exposure levels. So again, we're both involved in this, both our agencies, and we're trying to ensure that it's cleaned up to pre-existing conditions so there wouldn't be any PFAS there. But again, we're in a big lawsuit, and maybe it's important to note that this is, again, I can't answer why this is happening. I can just tell you that it is happening. Right across into Texas, 2 hours east of Cannon Air Force Base is Reese Air Force Base. Okay. And 18 months after we were sued by the Federal Department of Justice, the Department of Defense and the state of Texas entered into a voluntary cleanup program around Reese Air Force Base for PFAS. So why is New Mexico? I see you're both kind of squinting at me like, what is he saying? Why is it that the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense is treating New Mexicans different than Texans? I have no idea. But we are the recipient of a federal lawsuit, $12 million in towards litigation, no remediation at either base offsite. Meanwhile, Reese Air Force Base has just hit milestones saying that they've now cleaned up a lot of the PFAS around the base. No
the federal
lawsuit.
government's doing something different there.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
but they are doing something very different there, and they're working with their state regulators voluntarily to get it cleaned up, investing those dollars.
Yeah. Well, I want to just clarify also how it is dangerous. Is it just if you ingest, or is it aerosol at all? Like, just for people to know generally, like if I'm near the foam, oh my gosh, is that bad?
Yeah, I would say largely the main route of exposure is consumption or drinking PFAS contaminated water. That is clearly the most common way you're exposed to it. There's been some studies in and around chemical plants in the Northeast that show that it's moving through the air and depositing in 80 miles away into people's well water because there's no other sources. So they're figuring out that there's some what they call air deposition happening. We've not seen that here in New Mexico based on its use as a firefighting foam. So really it is a drinking kind of exposure that you would have to something like that.
Okay.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
Outside of these military bases that we mentioned, we know there's also PFAS contamination elsewhere in New Mexico. The U.S. Geological Survey put out a news release in April of 2024 addressing some recent studies in partnership with the Environment Department here. Among its findings, PFAS were detected in all major rivers of New Mexico, with the highest concentrations from sites downstream of urban areas. Albuquerque was also flagged as significantly contributing to PFAS in the Rio Grande. What is the takeaway from this research? Should regular citizens be worried or change anything about the products they use or their daily living, even near bodies of water?
So that's a great question. And what we've done in this last legislative session is the Environment Department drafted a bill and it passed, and the governor signed it into law that will begin to eliminate PFAS from like your commercial products that you would buy at big box stores, and at least put warning labels on products that will continue to be sold that contain PFAS. So can I tell you a quick story here?
Please.
And I think it makes it really relatable as to how PFAS gets into the environment, even if you don't live around a base. So we went to a big box store to buy a piece of furniture for our house, something we all do probably. They offered to put a stain-resistant spray on it, and I asked to see what was in that. Like, I asked for the info. So they're talking to somebody who's very knowledgeable now, right, about what's in these sprays, and they said it's safe, it's non-toxic, it doesn't contain any PFAS. And I said, great, I'd love to see the chemical data sheet that you're required to have, and they showed it to me, and it contained PFAS for sure. So what I wound up doing, what my department wound up doing was going to their warehouse where they spray it. So they apply it locally, like they spray it locally if you order it that way, if you buy the furniture that way. And what they were doing was spraying the furniture, and they throw the containers into a dumpster out back, and then they wash the floor down to the Albuquerque Bernalillo wastewater treatment plant. And then think about that happening every single day, right? So PFAS is going to get into the Rio Grande to the point that USGS found it. Not surprising. But those chemical products or those commercial products that retailers are telling us are safe are often not safe. Mm-hmm. And then the application is getting directly into our storm sewers, into our municipal landfills, and it continues to migrate from there. That's what the bill we passed and the governor signed into law will begin to stop and make our rivers and groundwater even cleaner, so we're not in litigation trying to get people to clean it up.
Do you think those workers knew, or did they just believe that PFAS was not in there?
I think we've all had those kind of part-time jobs before. I certainly have, working in retail, and I'm sure I said things that I didn't understand because I was trained to sell things, right? So I don't think there's anything malicious about what they're doing. But
people just aren't educated.
They're not
yet.
educated as retailers or as consumers. What's interesting though is, you can go to these big box furniture stores and still buy these bottles of stain resist, just take home and spray. And the PFAS in those little bottles is 50 times the drinking water standard. So that little bottle, kind of think of it as like a little bit of a chemical warfare agent. But that little bottle itself is more toxic than what EPA says you should be drinking. And you're able to go and just buy that and spray it right in your house. And the bottle itself, like I have one sitting in my office that says it's non-toxic, non-hazardous. And the chemical in there was manufactured, the PFAS chemical that's in that bottle, they stopped manufacturing it in the United States in 1999. So for 25 years, it's been sitting in a warehouse, and they're bleeding it out into these retail products and selling it to all of us. So we're tackling that.
What should you do if you do have one of those bottles? Like, where do you throw it?
Yeah, great question, because I have them in my house too. So, there's household hazardous waste collections that happen throughout the state, and those would be where I would start and take it to those locations. I myself wouldn't dump it down the drain, but I'm sure people are doing it every day unknowingly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're just, I think as our conversation has really highlighted, this feels like at the starting point of a larger, conversation about just what exactly the long-term risks are for something like this. It's just not really well known and much in the dialogue, or it's starting now to get there. But, there's a lot of questions people have about it.
But let me also not paint like a terrifying picture, right? So big box retailers like Home Depot, Lowe's, Home Goods, Dollar Store, they've all voluntarily phased PFAS out of their products. So there are handfuls of retailers in New Mexico that have not, that are corporately owned, like big box stores, but some of the places that we all shop, if you pick up something at a Home Depot or Lowe's to protect your fabric or to clean your floor, polish your furniture, etc., you can be assured that that is PFAS free because they, as a corporate entity, have phased it out nationally. So again, I want to be clear, a little bit of consumer education, just jumping on their website and saying, checking to see if they phased out PFAS, and then knowing that everything in that store is good.
Yeah. It does feel like this is the beginning of a long road here. I think everyone can agree that, cleanup and less exposure are probably all good things for us and for the environment, but there are a lot of questions about sort of the long-term and prolonged exposure, what that will mean for, our generation, the next generation, for the environment, for human health. What is next for you in continuing your work to address the PFAS issue here?
So I think I have a big philosophy on this, or maybe a simple philosophy that to guide it all, which is chase the risk. Figure out where New Mexicans are the most exposed and disrupt the hell out of it, right? Like prevent that from happening. So we're now starting to test landfills to look to see what has been put in them, and are we seeing PFAS? There's always a liquid coming out of them. What does that look like? Is it a big risk? What do we know about wastewater treatment plants? Like, how do we, one, keep PFAS out so that we can use those biosolids, those sludges, to continue to fertilize our farmland? But the point is we have to look for where PFAS is in the environment and how did it get there, and then chase that down. So it might feel a bit terrifying, but there's a team of people at the environment department who are so excited because they feel like they're on the right side of this issue, and I agree we are. And we're going to chase that risk and disrupt it so New Mexicans don't have to worry about it. And that's kind of what we're doing, is chasing the risk. So we're doing all sorts of sampling around the state of New Mexico to figure out where are we seeing PFAS.
And on the other side of the research, it seems like the studying of the actual health risks for people is still something that's going on, right?
Yeah.
Like, how is this affecting people's health?
Yeah. So again, there's a lot of health data out there, peer-reviewed scientific data. Physicians are now becoming educated on should they start testing people for PFAS, and what does it mean? So let's assume like a listener, maybe one of us, had high cholesterol, right? Just something somewhat, it's not cancer, but it's something to think about. Like your doctor says you have high cholesterol. They may want to put you on something like a prescription drug like Lipitor. But if your high cholesterol you have it because you live by a military base and you have high cholesterol as a symptom of PFAS exposure, you might be over-medicating by taking Lipitor that will not necessarily have the benefit of reducing your cholesterol levels because your exposure to PFAS is the underlying condition. So like where I worry about that for New Mexicans, right? Because any doctor is going to say exercise more, eat better, and go on Lipitor if you have high cholesterol, or go on a statin of some kind to reduce your cholesterol. But if they're not understanding what the basic PFAS exposure can do, and that might be the causality of your high cholesterol, then they're not solving the problem. But that's one example of, like, again, what we're working on to figure out. But there's so many newly documented issues around PFAS, including fertility issues are now coming out, low birth weight, developmental disabilities, and with New Mexico's, really significant investment in early childhood development and success rates, like, we have to talk about PFAS as a means to make families successful and children healthier.
Can we test for PFAS in ourselves? Like, is that an easy test to do?
Yeah, it's a blood test. It may not be cheap, but it's literally a pinky size amount of blood. We've done that in Clovis, and soon we're going to be releasing those blood test results in aggregate, not any one specific data. But we've been doing blood testing now in New Mexico for about a year for residents in Clovis. Totally voluntary, but yeah, it's totally possible to do that.
Okay.
Well, that'll be something certainly to pay attention to, and we look forward to the results and the more developments here on this story. And thank you for sharing so much of the background and what is happening here with a significant environmental issue here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and thank you for having me and covering this topic. I think it's one of the most significant issues in the Environment Department, but one of the most significant issues affecting New Mexicans.
Yeah. Secretary Kenney, thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Secretary James Kenney for taking the time and sharing his knowledge about PFAS with us. Some really terrifying stuff if you think about it. On the way out, I was asking him, how do you get rid of PFAS if it's in your body? And he said, well, through donating blood or breastfeeding, you can pass it along to your child. So also very terrifying to think about in that regard.
Yeah, it's clearly a issue that I think there has to be so much more investigation into, whether that's cleanup or, how we do that in the environment and also in ourselves. I don't know.
And with our
it's
doctors.
An incredible thing. So yes, we appreciate you listening here for this episode here today. Certainly a topic I think we'll pay attention to. If you have any ideas about a story related to this or others, let us know. I'm at chris.mckee@krqe.com, also at Chris McKee TV.
And I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. Thank you all for listening and watching.